All right, well, welcome to our discussion of the greatest win and the greatest sin in the book of Devarim. The book of Devarim is all about a review of Jewish history, which Moshe goes about presenting as he's about to pass away. Within about a month of his passing, he tells an entire review. The question is, as he reviews it, what floats to the top? Which wins and which sins are most prominent? As we reflect back on Jewish history, particularly that in the desert, and we'll go a little bit beyond that. What are the salient sins and wins? And not just to answer the question with one word of what the answer is, but rather to understand why. Why would those things be particularly salient, particularly important, particularly sinful, particularly great as achievements or as sins? So let's take a look at it, and we'll go from there. Perhaps from this we can learn something about how we should approach the destruction of the temple, which is coming up, a commemoration of it on Tisha B'Av this Thursday, Wednesday night, Thursday, coming up. Perhaps the sins that took place then can tell us something about what type of sin we should avoid today as well. So here we go. I'm going to share a screen with you, and we'll get started. So Moshe begins his review in Parshat Devarim, and let's see about it. So firstly, what are the candidates for the biggest sin? The biggest sin in general, right? What are some of the candidates, right? If you think about it, right, you go back to the beginning of the 40 years, you can think about the different candidates, right? The big candidate is Egel HaZahav, the golden calf, the Meraglim, the spies. Now, Korach was there was a small group that was behind Korach. Of course, the rest of the Jews didn't declare their loyalty per se to one side or the other, only in as much as they stayed away from Korach when Moshe told them to stay away. Zimri and Baal Peor, that was a national crime, and that also could be seen as one of the worst sins and crimes. We talked about that in one of our other classes about Pinchas and about the book of Bamidbar. So let's take a look. Now, it's interesting, we mentioned Bamidbar. Most of this stuff is in Bamidbar. The Egel, the golden calf, is not mentioned in Bamidbar. The golden calf goes back to Exodus. So in Exodus, clearly the Egel, the golden calf, is the key. In Numbers, clearly the spies and maybe these other sins are key. And the question is, what about in Devarim? In Devarim, is it going to go with Exodus that the golden calf is most important, or is it going to go with the book of Bamidbar, where perhaps the spies, the Meraglim, are the salient sin? We'll talk about the great wins later. So if we want to focus perhaps within this list on the golden calf, the top two, the golden calf and the Meraglim, the spies, it's interesting to note that the golden calf and the spies correspond to the two periods in which we find ourselves right now. We are now in the 3 weeks between what? 17th of Tamuz, Sphard-Beth Tamuz, and Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av. What happened on the 17th of Tamuz? 40 days after the 6th of Sivan, 7th of Sivan, when Moshe went up to get the tablets, comes down with the Shnei Luchot HaBrit, with the tablets, and what does he see? He sees the golden calf. When was it? 17th of Tamuz. What did he do? He broke the tablet. What happened later? The walls of Jerusalem broke. So we're already a few weeks out from 17th of Tammuz, and then we're a week and a half out from the 9th of Av. The 9th of Av, what happened? That was one of the things that happened, was that it was declared against our ancestors they would not enter the land of Israel. Why wouldn't they enter the land of Israel? Because of the spies. So the sin of the spies took place on the 9th of Av, and the golden calf on the 17th of Tammuz. Now you can already see, we know Tisha B'Av is a greater day of mourning than 17th of Tammuz. So we can already see that the spies seem to be more prominent than the golden calf. But let's think about that a little further. So let's look at each one. How bad is the golden calf? How bad are the spies? And we'll see, we'll compare and contrast. How bad is the golden calf? So Hashem says to Moshe, he says, he says, leave me alone. And I'm going to get really, really mad at the Jews. And I will destroy, wipe out, I will end the Jewish people, and I'll make you, Moshe, a great nation. We don't need the other people. So there was notion that through the golden calf, God would wipe us out. That's pretty bad. Erev Meni Vashvidim. And so that was in Shemot. When it's retold by Moshe in his review of the history in Devarim, in this book we're reading now, Deuteronomy, there it says, get away from me, and I will destroy them. I'll wipe out their name. And I'll make you a very great nation. So both Devarim and Shemot say that there was a threat of annihilation. I'm not sure if there's a difference between Achaleim, I will end them, Ashmideim, I will destroy them. But basically, God threatened to wipe us out because the golden calf was such a terrible sin. Did God forgive us for the sin of the golden calf? Well, in Exodus it says, God changed his mind about the bad he was going to do. He changed his mind about the punishment. It doesn't say there that he forgave us. In Exodus, it also says that he says, well, am I going to forgive them? I don't know. Just go on. Take the people to the land which I told you to go to. And my angel will go in front of you. I'm not going to come with them, but I'll send an emissary to go with them, so to speak. But on the day when I remember, I'll put their sin on them. He says, but when I make an accounting, I'll bring them to account for their sins. So did he forgive them? Well, not really. He said, I'll get you for it later down the road. I'll get you for that one. So I don't know. Did he forgive us or didn't he forgive us? He changed his mind not to punish us, but then he said he would give it to us later. What does that mean? What do you mean he's going to give it to us later? So Rabbi Yosef Choshor, one of the great rabbis of France after Rashi, he said, Klomar, ani mochel lahem ata, shelo yazoku badavar hazeh, kol zman shelo yosifu lachto. He says, right now I'll forgive them. So he does think there was forgiveness. Or I'll waive the punishment, that they shouldn't be punished, shouldn't be harmed on this particular matter, as long as they don't continuously sin. As long as they don't continuously sin, that's fine. But if they sin again, I'm going to get them not only for whatever they do now, but for the sin of the golden calf. So he never completely forgave him for the golden calf. The Ibn Ezra has an interesting thought. He says, I'll remember every year, the beginning of every year, I'll remember them. Remember the sin of the golden calf. We're always suffering for the golden calf. The Rabbi says that he said he did remember the sin of the golden calf. The sin of the golden calf when he punished them for the spies, and then it was declared that they should die. So he didn't kill them that day when they'd only been out of Egypt for 90 days. He didn't kill them then. But eventually, when the sin with the spies, he put the sin of the golden calf on them. So really, he wanted to wipe them out with the sin of the golden calf, but he only landed out wiping them out with the sin of the spies a year later. And according to the rabbis in Sanhedrin, there's no sin that doesn't have a little bit of a leftover from the sin of the golden calf. And it was to this day, if God remembers, if God gives us any punishment, so he said, what did I do wrong? He said, well, you did this, that, and the other thing wrong, plus the golden calf. It's the Jewish, the national original sin. The national original sin is golden calf. So it's pretty big. It's pretty big. On the other hand, he didn't actually destroy us, didn't actually forgive us. That's not good. If he didn't actually forgive us, that's pretty bad. But he didn't take any great punishment at that moment. Now let's look at the spies. What about the spies? How bad is it? We know it's bad. As I say, how bad is it? Or was it? In Bamidbar, it says, Vayomer Hashem Salach Yisrael. In Bamidbar, when this story is told of the spies, it says very specifically, God forgave us. So it seems that the sin of the spies is not as bad as the sin of the golden calf, because he did forgive us for this explicitly, whereas the other one was not. We'll see in a minute. It's not so simple. But the Tosfot in Yevamot says as follows. Nizofin hayu. The Jews were excommunicated, says the Gemara in Yevamos. So the question is, why were they excommunicated? Rabbi Yitzchak, Rashi's great-grandson, says, Vimaisem Meraglim. They were excommunicated from the time of the sin of the spies. They were excommunicated. But now what Rashi said they were excommunicated in the days of the Egel. He says, that's not true. Because God forgave us of the sin of the golden calf. He said, Salachti. He said, you're forgiven. And after all, after that, there was a tabernacle. And God put his presence on us. So first, let me make the case for the Tosfot, and then let me explain why the big question against it. The case is, he says, after which sin did God remove, did God say, I'm done with you people, I don't have anything to do with you? So he said, that was the sin of the spies. From the moment of the spies, God basically didn't talk to us anymore until 40 years later, 38 years later. But when the sin of the golden calf, God spoke to us. What do you mean spoke to us? We built a Mishkan about 80 days afterwards, and we finished building it about a year, a little less than a year later. And God put his divine presence in our midst, in our Mishkan that we built with our own hands, and he dwelt among us. So we're excommunicated? By no means. God had his greatest presence among us in the desert, and with those Jews who had committed the sin of the golden calf. All right, some died, but the Jews who were guilty of silence during the golden calf, they were still there, and God put his presence among us. But not so with the spies. The Jews were nizofin lamakom for 40 years, 38 years. God had nothing to do with us. He didn't speak to Moshe even once, as Rashi says. God was done with us. So he makes a good argument that actually the sin of the spies was worse, because that's when God says, I'm done with you people. However, there's a question. Tosfot said, oh, the sin of the golden calf, God said, I forgive you. Is that what we just read? We didn't just read that. We said in Bamidbar, which talks about the spies, that's where God said, I pardon you. He didn't say, I pardon you regarding the Egel, remember? Regarding the Egel, the golden calf says, I'll just move on. I'll give you the punishment later. God changed his mind. It doesn't say he forgave him. So what is Tosfot talking about? So Chizkuni was also one of the rabbis from the Tosfot. He's a big follower of Rabbi Yosef B'Chor, and he says like this, I have forgiven you as you yourself have said. What does that mean? So Hashem says, I forgive you like you said. And we say it Yom Kippur night. God willing, we should be in Shul Yom Kippur night. We say, I forgave you like you said. What do you mean like you said? Where do you say? So he said the episode of the golden calf. In other words, I forgive you in the sin of the golden calf, but now I can't forgive you. I did forgive you once when you told me to forgive you in the golden calf. But now, I ain't forgiving you now. I can't forgive you. And the next verse says, you're gonna die in the desert, and you're not gonna take the Jews into Israel. And he gets really mad at the Jews, and he gives tremendous punishment. And when he said, I forgive you, he says, I did forgive you. I had forgiven you. He doesn't mean he forgave him now. So according to Tosfot, was the sin of the golden calf forgiven? Yes. Proof? Just not too long later, God put his presence among the Jews. Was the sin of the spies forgiven? No. Sin of the spies, he said, that's it. You're finished. I'm not going to talk to you anymore. And you will die in the desert, each one of you. So that's in Bamidbar. Hashem seemed to say, forgive them, but maybe it really means he forgave them last time. In Devarim, in the book we're starting to read now, he says, God doesn't say he forgave them. He just says, nobody's going to see the land of Israel. He just punishes them. Okay. So if we want to analyze which is worse, the golden calf or the sin of the spies, and we want to analyze it by the punishment, he didn't punish them in the golden calf. He punished them with the spies. If you want to analyze it by forgiveness, you say, well, he didn't say he forgave us for the golden calf, but he did forgive us for the spies. But actually, Tosfot turns around. It's actually the other way around. So if you turn it around, then both the punishment and the forgiveness are the same. That the punishment is worse for the spies, and God did not forgive us for the spies because the spies are worse. So you could make that argument. And then which of the sins does Moshe start off with? Moshe is going to review the whole history. As Rashi says, in the very first verse, there's an allusion to the golden calf and everything else. But which sin does he start off with? So in the explicit text, you know what he starts off with? The spies. It's all about the spies. Now, there is a reason for that. We're about to enter the land of Israel. So he says, let me explain something. I know you may wonder, what have I been doing for the last 40 years? Where do we make the wrong turn? He says, let me explain something. When we're reviewing the history, it's very simple. we were only 11 days away from Israel, but you guys sinned. You didn't want to go to Israel, and that's why we're in the mess that we're in. So that's why he starts off. But also, I would say, by starting off with the sin of the spies, Moshe is saying the sin of the spies is the worst thing. The worst thing was the sin of the spies. Later, in 2 weeks from now, he's going to mention Parshat Akev. We'll talk about the sin of the golden calf. But the emphasis is on the sin of the spies. So again, we can argue that the sin of the spies was worse than the golden calf. And let's start thinking about that. Worse than the golden calf. How can you be worse than the golden calf? The golden calf is where the Jews rejected God. They worship a different God. Well, some say it wasn't really a different God. It was just an intermediary, but it was some sort of idolatry. Anything worse than idolatry? So we have to think about that. Now let's notice some interesting similarities. Some rabbis in Israel pointed out there's some interesting similarities between the spies and the golden calf. Both took place after 40 days, right? Moshe went up to the mountain for 40 days. He comes down. They did the golden calf. What happened with the spies? They went on a tour for 40 days to see Israel. They came back. They said, Israel's no good. We can't go. So both took place after 40 days. In both cases, Moshe pleaded for their lives of the Jews in both cases. So it's interesting, the parallel between the two. Now, so if we look in Devarim and we say, well, how bad was the sin of the spies? So a little more information. He says, Bamidbar says, I'll make a pestilence, it'll wipe them all out, give them a little corona, wipe them, the corona is not, it doesn't wipe everybody out, but it'll give them some sort of pestilence, it'll wipe everyone out, and I'll make you a great nation. But in Devarim, he says, if not one of these people will see the land of Israel that I swore to them. And it also says that God got mad at him at that moment and said, you wouldn't go to Israel either. So in Devarim, we say that during the golden calf, God got mad at Aaron, and during the spies, he got mad at Moshe, and he said, "That's it. You're not going to take the Jews to Israel either." I mean, once God said that that Joshua will bring them to Israel, it kind of gave it away that Moshe would not lead the Jews. So. And then we said, does God forgive us? We said that in Bamidbar he does. Good. Now, what is the nature of these sins? What is the nature of the sin of the spies and the sin of the golden calf? Well, let's think about it. Sin of the golden calf is either total idolatry, in which case it's a rejection of God. It's like committing adultery against God. Or it's a rejection of Moshe. They said, well, we don't have Moshe. Let's get like some sort of talisman, some sort of idolatry that will replace Moshe in relating to God. It was the idea that maybe we don't relate directly to God, we'll relate to God through an intermediary. It was the idea of taking something golden, a calf. Egypt is a beautiful calf. So maybe a return to Egypt, some sort of return to Egypt. So it's that type of sin. What about the sin of what's the nature of the sin of the spies? Sin of the spies. What's wrong? So we'll see in a moment what that nature is. We'll get to that in a second. But then if we think, why was the first temple destroyed and why was the second temple destroyed and which one was worse? So, well, the first temple was destroyed. If you look in Isaiah, you look in Jeremiah, they say, you look in Ezekiel, the other prophets, they say it was a sin of idolatry. We rejected God. What about the second temple? No, the second temple, the Jews were very holy. They were rabbis and all kinds of things. I mean, some people were Sadducees or what, but basically people worship God. So it wasn't idolatry. What was it? Sinat chinam. We weren't good to each other. Mm-hmm. So which one was worse? I don't know. The second temples lasted 2,000 years. First one was only a 70-year punishment. So it seems that when Jews commit idolatry, it doesn't seem to move God that much. That doesn't bother him so much. He can forgive that in some way, like Tosfot said, but he can still rest his presence with us. But when there's something else And the question is, what is that something else? In the case of the Second Temple, it was needless hatred. What about in the case of the spies? What was it? Now, if we look at the other sins, what were they? The Jews complained. The Jews rebelled against Moshe with Korach. Zimri committed acts of immorality. Quite right. What were some other wins? Well, we talked about this is one of the greatest sins and wins. There was a splitting of the sea. So Moshe does not focus on the splitting of the sea in this book. Sichon and Og. He does mention the 10 plagues, are mentioned later on in Devarim. Sichon and Og are emphasized. In Moshe's review, one of the first things he says, look, I destroyed Sichon. I destroyed Og, the great giant. Melech HaBashan, Og Melech HaBashan, the great giant. His bed was 9 feet, 12 feet tall. So that's emphasized as one of the great achievements, that we destroyed 2 great leaders in Transjordan. Of course, another win was when Pinchas killed the sinners. And of course, then the defeat against Bilam. So let's see how it's described in Jewish literature. Jim Kugel was here not too long ago. I guess it was kind of long ago, and one of his ideas is the Bible as it was. He has a book, Bible as it was. What does that mean? That sometimes you don't have to go to the Midrash, which is written later. You can look in the Bible itself, and it'll tell you how they view it. How did Jews view the sin of the spies? How did Jews view the Pinchas or the Sichon and Og? Already, as the Tanakh continues to be written, like in the Psalms, which is hundreds of years after the Exodus from Egypt, we already have, it might be 200 years, it might be 400 years, depending how you count it. We already have a review of Jewish history, and let's see, how did David in the Psalms, how did he think about going back to history? How did he think about it? What points came up as the salient points? What came up as the most important wins and sins within Jewish history? So a beautiful psalm we can look at is Psalm 106. There are a number of historical psalms, and one of my favorite is Psalm 106. And there it says, we have sinned we have acted wickedly. What happened? He says, Lo iskilu miflotecha, they didn't appreciate all your wonders, 10 plagues. Lo zachu rov chasadecha, they didn't remember your kindness. One of the memories that we don't always focus on is that even at the splitting of the sea, the Jews were rebellious. They said, get us out of here, take us back to Egypt. This is an interpretation that's one of the bad sins. Interesting. The Psalm 106 goes on. Kufav. Even though we were bad at the splitting of the sea, God made it dry. We walked through there. We went through the desert. He saved us from different enemies, probably alluding to Amalek. God drowned the Egyptians. No one was left. Good. So the splitting the sea is prominent. He says they quickly forgot God. They forgot all the things he'd done for us. All right, what did I do for you lately? And they didn't wait for his plan. It's an interesting expression, maybe related to the essence of our lesson today, and that is being with God's plan. Interesting. It remembers that the sin of the fact that the Jews, what did they do? They complained. They complained. They desired more food. So it mentions that. God gave them whatever we wanted. We wanted food, wanted meat. God gave it to us. They were envy against Moses. They went against Moses and Aaron. So that's the spies. That's the Korach. So it alludes to Korach. Korach was a big deal. And what happened? Datan and Aviram were destroyed. It doesn't even mention Korach, but it mentioned Datan and Aviram. And there was a fire that came out and got rid of the wicked people because the 250 men who were with Korach were destroyed by a fire. For some reason it goes out of order, and then it says Yasu Egel Bachorib. They made an Egel, so it does mention that. They bowed down to some sort of molten image. Disgusting. They exchanged the glory of God for a bull that feeds on grass. How can they do that? Shachachu kel Moshe, they forgot God. Yiflod be'eretz cham, they forgot all the wonders God did in Egypt, all the things he did at Yam Suf, the splitting of the sea. Vayomer lashmitem, so God wanted to destroy us. Aha. So it says here that with the golden calf, God wanted to destroy us. Lulei Moshe b'chol b'peretz, lashiv chamatom yashchit. Only because Moses stood by the breach, confronted God, and he didn't destroy us. So we see here that the golden calf was a very serious thing. And then it goes on. It juxtaposes these two sins we've been comparing. It says, number one, they did the egel, the golden calf, and forgot God. God was about to destroy us. It's not for Moshe. But then וימאסו בארץ חמדה. Then they rejected the desirable land. They were disgusted with the beautiful, treasured land. They did not believe in his promise. So there are two elements. And these are elements that you can find a bit in the Parsha. Masher Mastem. You despised the land of Israel. Your children will not go to the land that you despised. The Jews despised the desirable land. So God was trying to give us something precious, something delicious, something beautiful, a treasure. And we despised it. We rejected it. It's like your father, your brother, your wife, your husband comes and they give you a beautiful gift and you take the golden earrings and you throw them on the floor. That's what the sin of the spies was. So it's one thing to worship another God. You know, people could sometimes forgive infidelity. Whether they should, they shouldn't, or whatever. Can you remarry someone if you were a whole interesting question. But to forgive someone who would take, let's say, an anniversary gift and take it and throw it on the ground, that would be a very difficult thing to overcome, wouldn't it? So, and also, lo means Devarim, they didn't believe his promise. We go back to the idea before that they didn't wait for his plan. They were not interested in God's plan. Or they didn't believe his word, his promise. God said, it's okay. You're going to conquer Israel. I'm going to give it to you. They didn't believe it. So not believing in God, it's even worse. Everyone was grumbling in their tents. They didn't listen to God. So that's another element. They didn't listen to God. God was going to destroy them in the desert. God was going to scatter them, all their children, among the goyim. God was going to scatter the children among the. Wait a second, I don't remember this part of the story. Where does this come from? That part of the sin of the spies was that God said, you know what? I'm going to send you to the other nations, and you'll live among the nations like we do today for the last 2,000 years. Where does that come from? So we turn to Rashi. Rashi says in Tehillim, from that time, it was decided at Tisha B'Av, the first Tisha B'Av, in the days of the spies, God said, I'm going to destroy the temple one day. Well, if he decided and everyone cried. So God said, you're crying now, you're going to cry forever. I'm going to destroy the temple and it'll be a night of crying forevermore. You're crying because you don't want to go to Israel. One day you'll cry because I'm going to destroy the temple on this very night. And once there's no temple, there's no glue to hold the Jews in Israel, and we're scattered among the nations. When God said that I'm going to destroy the temple, from the Midrashic reading of what happened that night, he was implying that he would also scatter us among the nations, because once you have Korban destruction, there's no magnet, and the Jews are disconnected. In Ezekiel 20, verse 3, the Malbim, a 19th century Polish commentary, connects Ezekiel and what we're saying. I promised them in the desert to scatter them among the nations. There is this ancient midrashic idea, not found in the midrash, found in Tehillim itself, in Yechezkel, that says that God in the desert promised to destroy their temple, by means of which they would be scattered among the nations. Why? Because they didn't listen to the commandments. Back to Psalm 106, they also did the Pa'or, the act of immorality and idolatry, with the Pa'or, this case where Pinchas came in and saved the day. And there was a terrible plague. Pinchas stood up. So, you might think, a lot of Jews probably never heard of Pinchas, right? If you had a bad Jewish education, you probably would never hear of Pinchas. But in Psalm 106, when he's reviewing this psalm, whether it's written by David or it's written later, whatever it is, the psalmist does not make light of Pinchas. Pinchas is a big deal, as we described in our video about Pinchas. Pinchas stopped the plague, because this was a plague against the sin of idolatry and immorality. And it was forevermore, it was a great thing that he did. Okay. So in Psalm 106, you have a number of the sins. The golden calf and the despising of the land of Israel, the sin of the spies, are emphasized, and the threat of annihilation is mentioned in both cases. And the other things are mentioned as well. Pinchas is a big deal. Korach is a big deal. There are other stories that are mentioned. The Korach, the complaining, these are all mentioned as well. Now, but perhaps the centerpieces are the golden calf and the sin of the spies. Psalm 136 also is said every Shabbos morning, and it says, praise God because he is good, for forever is his kindness. What should we praise him for? What was his kindness forever? What were the different kindnesses he did? So we start off, because he smote the Egyptians, the firstborn. So here we're going back to something which we haven't mentioned until now, with the smiting the firstborn, that was a big deal. Taking us out of Egypt, the great hand, fine. Splitting the sea, we know that that's a big one. And the drowning the Egyptians, taking us in the desert, that itself was great. Then he mentions destroying great kings. And Sichon Melech Hamori and Og Melech Bashan. So that which Moshe mentions at the beginning of this parsha, at the end of this parsha, Parshat Devarim, and it's alluded to at the beginning of the opening of the book as well, the destruction of Sichon and Og. Again, you won't hear this in Sunday school, but the destruction of Sichon and Og, the two Transjordanian kings, that's a big deal. Because one of them was a giant. One of them was someone that Moses was fearful of. These are people who conquered the Ammonites and other nations. So they're a big deal, and we destroyed them. And there was a good boost to our morale that we destroyed them, and now we're going to destroy the other nations. That's what Moshe says at the end of the parsha. He says, Joshua, don't worry. God destroyed these big nations, and he'll destroy all those little nations on the other side of the Jordan. It's a piece of cake. So the big win was against Sichon. Big win was against Og. This is, these are something that we don't always realize, but those are big wins as well. We've been looking at this chart throughout the book of Bamidbar, and we'll look at it one more time, right? The complaining only got some sort of plague. Miriam got leprosy. The spies were condemned for 40 years and they all died. Everyone there died if they were over 20. Korach, you have about 250 people plus Korach, Datan, and Aviram who were killed. Post Korach, there were 14,000 people were killed, and the Zimri thing seemed to have been the worst. So the Psalm 106 mentioned the sin of the immorality and idolatry that Pinchas solved. That was one of the worst things because the punishment was so bad, and it is mentioned in Psalm 106. So if we've made any sort of argument here that the sin of the spies is a biggie, it's something for which, the golden calf, he says, I'm not going to punish you now. Or they did the sin of the spies, he said, that's it. Now, it's not just like the straw that broke the camel's back, but it's also a sense that that's a big deal. What's the big deal about the spies? All the commentators try to understand, what's the big deal about the spies? So they didn't want to go to Israel. I mean, it's not the worst thing. I mean, I could be accused of that too. I'm sitting here in Memphis. I hope I'm not guilty of the spies. So he says, וימאסו. They despise the land of Israel. And again, maybe we are guilty of that. Since 1948, it's been an opportunity to come back to Israel. Since the 1980s, 90s, the aughts.
Rabbi?
Is a pretty big deal, and it's pretty easy to achieve. And yet we don't go. And to some degree, as Ramban points out, we are despising the land. Yes, Suzanne, Shira.
Wasn't most of the people who did the golden calf, weren't they the people that we brought out of Egypt? That were the majority of those people were the ones.
Yes, the rabbis say that all the sins took place with them. In the simple text, it doesn't say that, but necessarily. But yes, there's certainly a midrashic trend like that. But I will say the following: Rabbi Benjamin Blech should live and be well, pointed out the following. He said that the sin of the golden calf was not the golden calf was golden. It was the golden silence. The silence of the rest of the Jews, that was the problem. So, yes, it may have been a small group of maybe 3,000 people who were killed by the Levites who actually worshiped the golden calf, but the rest of the Jews were guilty forevermore because they were silent in the face of this tremendous thing. It was sort of like, you have like a big spectacle in the middle of town, the town square, and all these people are telling Aaron to build the golden calf, and he feels pressure that he's going to get killed if he doesn't, and he does it, and everyone else is standing around. So that's the problem. They all stood around. They should have said, "You're asking Aaron to build the golden calf? We're going to kill you." And that's what they should have said. But
if you see like rioters or looters and they're going crazy, and you might be scared and not say anything or do anything because those are people totally out of control.
Well, you're very kind, but apparently a God who's very merciful wasn't as kind about it. He was very mad at the Jews. So the Jews are guilty because we stood by. You can't stand by. But yeah, it's I mean, in any bad thing that goes on, you always ask yourself, would I be a righteous Gentile if they were killing, different types of people, and would I be the righteous Jew who saved everybody? It's very difficult to stand up against oppression and evildoers. It's true. Good point. So this expression of disgusting, it's one thing if let's say you go against God. All right, so God is used to that. But if you despise something that God gave you, if you say, this is a bad land, the land that was bad, that's part of what was so bad about this episode. If we could outline several different things. It's a rejection of their mission. And the whole mission is go out of Egypt and then go conquer the land and then establish a country that would be a testament to the whole world that God exists. They're rejecting their whole mission. It's a rejection of Moshe, which is a rejection of God, which is a rejection of the Torah. So you can't get worse than that. And then morally, it's ingratitude. God says, here's a beautiful land. He says, I don't want it. That is disgusting. It's despicable from a moral point of view, and a violation of morality. That is always the lowest of the low. That's why Pinchas, the story before Pinchas saved the day, the particularly bad story, the sin of Zimri and the Pa'or, because they committed an act of immorality. Also, the second temple was destroyed, and we're still suffering from that 2,000 years later because of improper relations between people. We didn't give honor to each other. Sinat chinam, we hated each other. So hatred of each other, hatred of the land of Israel, these are things that are intolerable. Ingratitude. Also, I would argue something else is perhaps not so obvious. A lack of connection or respect for the Avot, our forefathers. What do I mean? We know that when the spies went to Israel, at least somebody went to Hebron. Rabbi say it was Caleb, who was eventually awarded Hebron as he became the mayor of Hebron. He's the only person who had a special allotment of land. He went to Hebron. Why? Because he stopped in Hebron. Why did he stop in Hebron? He wanted to say a prayer at the tomb of the patriarchs. That in the merit of the patriarchs, he should be saved from this terrible idea of the spies. So when we don't want to go to Israel, it's a rejection of our forefathers. Israel is the land of God. It's also the land of our forefathers. And it's a rejection of the land that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob went to. And I learned that from this Midrashic Rashi idea that it was important that Caleb stopped in Hebron. He was the ultimate hero of the spy story, and he's granted Hebron the place of the tomb of the patriarchs, the Maran HaMachpelah. He's granted that because you're supposed to have a connection with the forefathers. So this is also why it's such an egregious sin. The biggest win we mentioned is Sichon and Og, because just as God destroyed Sichon and Og through Moshe, so God will do to all the kingdoms. It was a great morale booster for all of us. So if we ask ourselves a question, what was the greatest sin in the desert? So one could argue that it was the golden calf, and God just had mercy on them. They just got out of Egypt. He didn't want to destroy them then. So he punished us later. But really, that was the worst sin. However, you can argue that the worst sin was the spies, because the Jews we rejected our gift, and we rejected our mission. We rejected God and the Torah. It was ingratitude. It was therefore an interpersonal. I mean, it was against God, but it was it had an element of an immoral act between parties, between us and God, that God gave us this beautiful gift and we rejected it. It's a disgusting kind of thing to do. And it also showed a lack of connection to our Avot. And I would argue that, that when the Jews considered taking Uganda as the nation for ourselves, that was also a despicable thing, because it was a lack of respect for our ancestors. Now, we're not Ugandans. We don't belong in Africa or in Memphis. We have a particular place that we go. So we all have our excuses why we're not in Israel right now. But there is an element, says the Ramban, that there's a mitzvah, as it said in last week's parsha, to conquer the land of Israel, and the Jews should not reject their land. The wording of the Ramban, he's alluding to the spies, that when a Jew fails to live in Israel, to some degree, we are committing that act of rejection. Now, we understand sometimes we've been in exile, that's where God put us. We understand that Talmud says if you have financial reasons, family reasons, you have an excuse to live elsewhere. But ultimately, we have to have this eye on the prize, that eventually we have to go back to the land of Israel, because otherwise we're rejecting the mission of God. So that's a very serious thing. And perhaps that's why Moshe starts off the review of the 40 years with one point. The Jews committed the sin of the spies. With that, they rejected the mission. They rejected him, God, the Torah. It was an act of ingratitude. It was a despicable thing to do in rejecting the gift of God. They despised that gift. It was a lack of respect for their forefathers, and therefore, perhaps the most despicable crime in their history. But he says, don't worry, we're getting over that. And the best win we had was we destroyed Sichon and Og, and from now on, everything's going to be good. So with that, we conclude our discussion of the greatest sin and win in the desert.